And then comes the creation, in which the creator god and the lesser gods, which are symbolized by the planets, work together to create the human being, who is a mix of mortal and immortal natures, mortal and immortal. So it's like soul and body, and who must follow the divine laws, conquer negative emotion, and through the practice of love and wisdom to return to their star of origin. So you know what? Each one of us has a star. In Plato's theory, every human being has a star. One of those stars is your star out there. It's the star you came from, according to Plato. And in the process, you know, it's all the stars of heaven. And each person has a particular one. So this higher knowledge, the gnosis, is to recover your identity with your primal star. And what you have left of that primal star, according to this theory, is a spark within yourself, which is the divine spark that gives you life and awareness and consciousness. And then through this process of transformation, you can recover your origin of star and not be reborn, but return to your star of origin. So our star is a living being, according to Plato, a conscious being. Very full-blown theory at this point. And that through education and correct moral life, the soul is restored, and it is allowed to escape from rebirth and join into the highest realm of the gods and to the primal sources of beauty and wisdom. So this becomes, you can see how the theory is developed over time by Plato. This becomes the source theory for reincarnation in Western Esotericism. So now let's expand. Remember that map of the Aegean there? You know, the first map I showed you was actually this area right here. So now we have to expand into this picture and get into, you know, roughly the Pax Romana about 100 CE, and say that the doctrine and idea of Plato and Neoplatonism had actually spread through this entire area. Every place you see that's green on this map had theory of reincarnation. So it was a pervasive theory. The Gauls had it. You know, when Caesar goes up to Gaul and records the belief of the Gauls and the Druids, he says, well, they believe in coming back many lifetimes, one after the other. So there was a clearly, you know, not associated with the Greek world, but, you know, its own thing. Even up in Britain, you know, the Druids in Britain teaching some form of reincarnation, some basic theory. So it's a very pervasive concept. It's not a minor idea. It tends to be very pervasive. And what happens in this context? Well, there's a lot that happens here, because this is, of course, the time when Jesus shows up, and a lot of other influences that come along. So I'm going to try to sort of speed through this a little bit. Oops. First of all, we have to mention this ominous figure. This is Isis. Of all the religions of that period that were most popular, it was the Asiatic tradition. The temples of Isis were pervasive through that area. And the temples of Isis were places where people would go to dream, to connect to the gods and to their higher daemon, in order to have inspired direction from the gods on how to live their lives. But she is also the goddess of rebirth. Remember the story of Isis, how Osiris is chopped up into pieces all over Egypt, and she reassembles him and brings him back to life? This is like the thematic story, again, out of Egypt, that talks about rebirth. And we know for sure there may not have been rebirth in early Egypt, but Ptolemaic Egypt definitely had theory of reincarnation. So at least in this late period you get it. And Isis was considered to be the goddess of rebirth, the goddess of reincarnation. So there's an influence, and that influence actually transmits into Western esotericism through the Asclepius, which is a text that teaches reincarnation, and was translated into the Middle Ages, as well as the Pistis Sophia, which also teaches reincarnation. So those texts of reincarnation actually were transmitted into the medieval period and read by monks, could read these theories and see this tradition. And Isis is mentioned in Asclepius, and her as a goddess of rebirth. So it's not as though it's cut off. I mean, it continues to transmigrate through this area. Another source of transmission, now we're getting way past Plato here, so it's, you know, Plato probably infused the thinking of people, but we find it in the Asiatic tradition, we find it in the Hermetic tradition, because the god Thoth, right here, the god Thoth, though he takes both those forms, it became the Greek. This is an Arabic painting. I just happen to like that painting of Hermes. Becomes Hermes, the guide of souls. Remember the soul has a guide? Well, Hermes is the psychopomp that guides the souls. And when you look into the Hermetic text, these 17 Gnostic Hermetic texts we have, there are multiple theories of metempsychosis in those texts. And it's interesting to note that these small groups that were the Hermetic Gnostic groups seem to have had women teachers. I like to mention that because it seems like it sounds like it's all a masculine tradition, But here's an interesting aside, and that is that it seems that many of those texts could have been written by women. And so, and the people who were leading those small communities often were women, and they were teaching reincarnation. They were teaching metempsychosis. So that's another influence. And if you read through the text, you find multiple sources, and I can't really get into all that because there's just too many theories. But I mean, I can just say this: live a moral life, do no harm, and you will not necessarily come back. Otherwise, you'll be coming back through cycles, as it were. And so though there is something that's introduced in these texts, which is a soteriological theme. It's this idea of salvation. Think salvation in this sense, because Isis is a goddess of salvation. She's a soteriological goddess, and it's like belief in Isis or belief in Hermes helps to save the soul. And salvation in this case means not having to be reborn over and over again, then taken to the higher realm of the gods. So there's another influence, and yet another one which I have to mention, which is the Manichaeans. Mani was of this same period. He's Persian, but his influence is going to become pervasive. He had his teaching of the elect, the hearers, and the sinners, these three different aspects. And the elect who have been initiated into his teachings and who become priests, and that's a picture of the priest right there, would not be subject to rebirth. But those who were simply hearers, that is, they had heard the teaching, they had practiced some of the teaching, but were not purified sufficiently, would have to be reborn. There would have to be a series of lives until they were elect, and then they could escape rebirth, whereas sinners were simply subject to an endless rebirth and endless suffering in the world. So this was, and there is a story there that Mani was, he was attacked by the Zoroastrians because his doctrine was a little too heretical. And so he was banished. And where did he go? He went to India. So he was probably influenced by Indian teachings of reincarnation and brought them back to Persia, where I'm sorry to say he was martyred and killed by the Zoroastrians for his radical teachings. But nevertheless, it sort of reaffirmed the Indian connection again. So pretty rich.